Giuliana, Austin, thank you so much for joining us. Giuliana, let's begin the conversation with you. You wrote Texas Redistricting Showdown, Why the Fight Over 5 GOP Seats Reveals a Broken System. Tell us more about the battle over mid-decade gerrymandering, which exposes deep flaws in congressional representation.
So there's a gerrymandering problem that exists irrespective of when we do it. But in this particular instance, Texas has decided to do a redistricting mid-decade. Typically, redistricting happens after each census because the Constitution requires that a reapportionment take place after each census. So this is unusual and can only really be understood as a way to rejigger the political map in favor of a particular political party. But that, of course, is something that happens after a census also. It's just that typically we don't normally see that mid-cycle. So there's a kind of very clear indication that this is about politics. And of course, I'm sure listeners have all heard Trump saying, well, I need to get these 5 seats. And the state legislature, majority Republican legislature has said, okay, we're going to make it happen. So that's what's unusual here. But the structural problems of gerrymandering as a practice exist every time we redistrict. In some states more than others. Some states do have nonpartisan redistricting committees, but not all of them do. And the way that we apportion representatives is not equitable, given some of these deeper structural flaws. The one I write about, for example, is that we've capped the number of representatives, and yet the Constitution requires that every state has one. So what that means as a voter in California is that I am disproportionately underrepresented compared to every citizen in Wyoming. And that rubs a lot of us the wrong way. I'll say that because it also translates into electoral college votes, given that you add the number of senators to the number of representatives to get a state's electoral vote. So it actually has quite far-reaching implications. These structural problems have really far-reaching implications.
Could I just add something? And Giuliana, this is a very helpful way of thinking about gerrymandering. I worry that the problem of gerrymandering is not well understood, and that when people hear the word gerrymandering, they think it happens everywhere equally. And in fact, it does not happen everywhere, and it does not happen everywhere equally. So some of the least gerrymandered states are states that have congressional representation that is entirely of one party. I happen to live in one of those states, Massachusetts. But I don't think we would say that Massachusetts is a gerrymandered state. Its districts tend to be relatively compact. And I wonder whether you think that's right, that when we talk about gerrymandering, we don't want to convey that this is done everywhere and done everywhere with equal vigor.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think, again, I live in a state where we have a nonpartisan districting commission that draws the boundaries of the states. My always best example when I'm teaching this to students about, well, what do we mean when we're talking about gerrymandering is, the infamous district in North Carolina from 2010, 2012, the salamander, where you are actively working to create a certain political outcome by drawing districts intentionally. And I think you're absolutely right that most people imagine are not really as familiar with how intentional that practice is. Or that not everyone does it. In fact, there was a Supreme Court case not very long ago where the Supreme Court actually said, it was related to Arizona, that states voters in that case could decide to have the state's districting done by a commission, even though the Arizona legislature really wanted to keep control of redistricting for itself for particularly partisan purposes. But it is not the same everywhere. I think you're absolutely right.
And may I just ask you again, so one of the problems that we confront when we think about the problem of gerrymandering, if we can get it straight what it really means and where it happens, is whether or not there are any legal restraints on gerrymandering. And the Supreme Court quite recently said that the question of gerrymandering for political purposes is a political question, not a legal question, and left it to the states to work out whether and how they would engage in partisan gerrymandering. If gerrymandering is done with an intent to disadvantage people on the basis of their race, the court has said something entirely different. And I wonder from your work and your thinking, whether you think that the Supreme Court's decision that partisan gerrymandering is really not a legal or constitutional problem, whether you think that's right, or whether you think that decision does not serve us well.
I'm really glad you asked me that, because I was reading about this, your interpretation of it in the piece you actually wrote for the Fulcrum. You talk about the way that Justice Roberts appeals to historical practice as the basis, or at least one of the bases for the ruling, which says that, as you stated, that partisan gerrymandering is this is a state issue, not something that's really actionable by the federal courts. And I have to say that as a historian, having my discipline invoked so frequently these days, history and tradition is now the kind of bugaboo phrase at every conference. It's really difficult for me. I don't think it's correct. I think it's self-serving. I think it's selective. Right, as the opinion in the gerrymandering case said, well, they gerrymandered in the colonial period, and I'm thinking, right, but they didn't have political parties in the colonial period, so that doesn't quite work here. It's not quite an appropriate analog. And also, it presumes that the framers would have wanted something that existed in the colonial period to persist in the new republic. And I think there's ample evidence to suggest that they would have opposed that. Federalist 54, for example, Madison talks about how every representative's vote must have equal weight. So I think they got it wrong. I think I think they know that at some level they know that this is incorrect. But even if we granted their version of a deeper historical past were correct, which, as I've just explained, I don't, it overlooks the fact that regulation of elections and suffrage changed dramatically in the Constitution after the Civil War. And provisions in the 14th and 15th and 19th Amendments have empowered the federal government in ways that they did not have the power prior to that moment. So I think it's faulty on a variety of different points, both of law, but also just of historical fact.
Excellent points and excellent questions, Austin. Let's continue the conversation with what you wrote in that struck a chord. Why blue states had better get busy gerrymandering. In that column, you write, Michelle Obama famously advised Democrats, when they go low, we go high. This is the advice that Democrats no longer can afford to heed if they have any hope of helping to save American democracy. Tell us more.
So when there's a fire, we want the fire department to do whatever is necessary to put out the fire. Once the fire is out, we can think about what caused the fire, how to rebuild from the fire. I think that the Republic is on fire, and that the normal rules of politics do not apply in conditions of emergency. The fact that the President of the United States would say he is, quote, entitled to the 5 seats in Texas, because after all, he carried the state of Texas, reflects both a profound constitutional misunderstanding and also a moment of revelation of what I would describe as the emerging new constitutional order. So I think that Democrats need to understand that the house is on fire. And the normal rules, let's have nonpartisan commission do this, may lead us to a situation in which the constitutional republic itself is endangered. And look, here's something that I believe. You can't get to democracy democratically, but you can end democracy democratically. By that I mean the following. If the three of us were sitting around and we needed to make a decision, we would need to decide how are we going to make that decision. And there's nothing antecedent that would lead us necessarily to say we're going to do it by majority rule. So there has to be some animating principle that would lead us to say we're going to do it by majority rule. The Constitution in Article 4, a much neglected article in the Constitution, guarantees to the states a Republican form of government. That means if the people of Massachusetts want to depose Governor Moore Healey and install King Charles, the federal government would be obliged not to allow that to happen. And I believe that the response to Texas is a way of for blue states to try to preserve a Republican form of government at the federal level. Because that form of government must be presupposed by the existence of Article 4. You're not going to guarantee a Republican form of government to the states if you don't have it at the federal level. So I think that the gerrymandering that may happen in California or in Illinois or some other blue state is not just normal partisan shenanigans. It is almost a constitutional duty in order to preserve the constitutional republic.
I think this is all exactly right.
Then say more.
Yes, and lest you think that my own piece calling for, getting rid of some of these structural impediments is in any way in opposition to that. I think what you're ultimately getting at is you have to win the battle if you want to continue fighting the war for democracy. So in the short term, using the tools that you have to maintain the republic is in fact an essential obligation. And yes, we would like ultimately to have a more democratic, more equitable form of representation, right? That in fact isn't capped at an artificial number and creating this sort of weird math game. But that actually has to sort of be put on the back burner when the house is on fire, as you say. If you want to live to fight another day and preserve the kind of fundamental tenets of a Republican government, you have to use the tools that you have. And I'm reminded also, my actual chronological area of expertise is Reconstruction. And the conversations that American political leaders and thinkers had about the nature of states that had seceded and what was required for them to be a member of the Union was predicated on exactly this point, that they had a Republican form of government. This was a major point of discussion, an animating part of congressional debates about what statehood meant. And the maintenance of a Republican form of government is, I think, actually a constitutional obligation. And there is plenty of historical evidence to support that point, I think.
Yeah, I certainly think it's true. As I understand it, Hugo would know better. the piece that I wrote evoked commentary of the kind that suggested that this problem should be addressed at a more principled level. And instead of saying fight fire with fire, one should be laying out and advocating a quote better way to do it. And I respect that criticism, but I don't agree with it. I don't think that anything is justified in the name of the preservation of a constitutional republic. There clearly would be some limits.
Right.
That political theorists would call a condition in which the normal rules have been suspended. And how we behave in this condition in which the normal rules have been suspended requires us to think both at the level of principle, but also at the level of strategy. In the best of all possible worlds, governors in Texas or in Missouri or in Ohio or in Indiana would not be being pressured by the President of the United States, whose obligation is to see that the law is faithfully executed, stack the political deck. But that's a fact on the ground. And I think that Democrats are waking up to this new game. And you see it with Governor Pritzker's reaction in Illinois to the prospect of deploying the National Guard, or Governor Newsom in California. And I think that the new game also applies to this mid-district, mid-a-decade redistricting. And by the way, nope. Giuliana dropped a Federalist paper reference, so I need to drop a Machiavelli reference. Machiavelli in The Prince said, a virtuous person comes to grief, and a good political leader needs to learn how not to be good, but to use it according to need. Machiavelli is misunderstood as being, dare I say it, Machiavellian, but he really was suggesting that when the time requires it, one may need to act in ways which at other times would be regarded as unprincipled. So there you go, Hugo. In one conversation, you got the Federalist Papers and Machiavelli.
Now, look, I appreciate both of your candor, and to add to what you mentioned previously, Austin. Yeah, the reaction to your piece was one that was, we should not go for an eye for an eye, but I do understand we are living in extraordinary times, and this isn't the norm, right? Not just Trump 2.0, but really since 2016. And so I personally agree that, taking the high road just doesn't work anymore, and you really need to get in the mud, although many people don't agree with me, with you, with us. That said, as a publication that strives, not always successfully, in trying to identify common ground, right? Because we believe that that is the foundation to be able to collaborate and work together. If you're saying the solution is to fight fire with fire, doesn't that just how does that help the house that's on fire if you're throwing gasoline at it?
Good, but you're not. So I think the metaphor only goes so far. This is not a sophomore seminar in philosophy that we're living in. Alas, unfortunately. The situation we are living in, which is what I've tried to articulate, is a situation of a kind of constitutional emergency.
Mm-hmm.
My argument is not unprincipled. It's rooted in Article 4 of the Constitution. So I don't think it's devoid of principle. I certainly don't want to get down in the mud. And I don't believe, which is why I cited Machiavelli, that whatever the other side does, your side needs to get down in the mud. No. But the preservation of the republic itself, which I believe, may be wrong, which I believe is at stake now, may justify what philosophers would call the choice of the lesser of two evils. There is no good choice. Oh, we just go along doing our thing, and they gerrymander 5 seats in Texas, and the Republicans retain control of the House of Representatives and continue to destroy a fundamental constitutional principle of separation of powers and checks and balances. They just don't, whatever the president says. So I don't think it's a question of we get down in the mud. I think it's a question that we recognize that there are some principles whose survival depends upon invoking Machiavelli's wisdom. Use according to need, not as a principled political life, not as this is what we're going to do. And the fear that if we do it, they will do it, we're already there. Do you think that people who are trying to stack the deck on the 2026 elections are going to not do it if those who believe in constitutional democracy, if we just, oh, well, that's fine, let them gerrymandering, let them gerrymander. So, I think people should be concerned about what is over the horizon. But my view is, look, what do we know? Historians will tell us this. Authoritarian governments are seldom, if ever, overthrown peacefully. So maybe if we can act now to try to maintain the kind of constitutional bulwark that we have, maybe in the end we will all be better for it.
I think part of what this is something I say to my students a lot when we're kind of wrestling with questions of this sort, where there are multiple layers of principle and strategy and concern. Many things can be true at the same time. And it can be true that in an ideal, that we should be working toward an ideal that appears to us to be more fair, right? At the kind of nonpartisan commission. But it is also true that if the current efforts to restrict the voting power of some people over others, we will never have that opportunity.
Right. So
if you want that as your objective, which I think is far more democratic than what we do now, as I wrote, right? I think these are structural problems that diminish the voting power of some people over others. That is inherently unfair. But it is also true that if we do nothing now, that will be impossible. So that's what I mean by you have to win this battle if you want to keep fighting in the war. So I always encourage my students to think in this way, and I would encourage listeners to think in this way. And my historical analog would be, look at other constitutional crises. The one I teach is the Civil War, the biggest one there is. Lincoln did a lot of things that were questionable because the immediate necessity required it if he was going to save the Union, right? That was the calculation. When the stakes get to that place, that need question, whether or not the nation or the republic survives, that changes the calculation of what can be done principally or in a principled way, or what can simply be dismissed as unconstitutional. And in fact, after the Civil War, the Supreme Court actually kind of retroactively confirmed Lincoln's view of the nature of secession. Of course, but it was unsettled for the entire time that war persisted. So here, thinking about this in as a long game, as a long process, where the objective is, if you believe in the Republic and you can understand and appreciate the risks to the Republic that exist at present and the degree of risk, right? You have to rethink what's necessary. You have to think differently about strategy and about, again, what you can support. I agree with Austin here, right? He's not saying, and none of us are saying, I think, we should pursue this route simply as a fighting fire with fire. It's much more nuanced than that. It is yes, in on Blue Sky on Twitter, it looks that way. But to somebody who's sitting down and reflecting, from a basis of professional knowledge or experience in terms of what does it look like when the Republic is facing this kind of threat, there's a PR version, and then there's the actual principled commitment to preserving the Republic and doing what is required to preserve the Republic. That I would argue this is principled resistance that takes the form of something that can be easily misidentified as pouring gasoline on the fire. I don't think that's what it is. I think it's actually principled resistance, but the PR version to drum up support often works better if it has a kind of boisterous quality to it, has a kind of soundbitey, memeable quality to it.